everyone. Welcome. So this is the third and last pre-conference panel. My name is Prema Kurian, and I'm the current president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. So we've had two panels already. The first two centered American Christianity. The first one focused on white American Christians and white evangelical Christianity. And then the second one focused on Black American religion, primarily Black Christianity. So the goal of this third panel is to focus on some ways in which globalization and transnationalism, transnational links impact religion in the US. So in other words, the goal of this panel is to decenter American Christianity, and each panelist will do that in a slightly different way. So we have four panelists. Dr. Stephen Offutt is Associate Professor of Development Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary. Dr. Jacob Olupona is Professor at the Harvard Divinity School. Dr. Nazli Kibria is Professor of Sociology at Boston University. And Dr. Bandana Purkayastha is Professor of Sociology at the University of Connecticut. So we will first have all of them do their presentations, and then we will move to the Q&A session. But feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation. You can send it to the Q&A link. So this session will be recorded, and the recording will be available on our website. It usually takes about a week to 10 days for it to show up on our website. So if you're not able to stay for all of it, I hope you can stay for all of it, but you can always go back to the website. Oh, Karen, is it being recorded? Karen?
I'm sorry, yes, it is recording.
Okay. Okay, so we missed the first introduction.
It's been on.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. You know the order. We'll go with Dr. Offutt first, then Jacob Olupona, and then I don't know, between Bandana and Nazli, I'll let you decide how you're going to do that. But they're doing it together, so they will, do it at the end. So go ahead, let's start. Stephen, yes.
Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for this opportunity. It's really a privilege to be in this conversation and to be among these distinguished panelists. I've been asked to talk about two related themes. The first is Christianity's recentering to the global South, and then also connections between US Christians and global South Christians. The first theme acknowledges that global Christianity has undergone major changes. One could argue that in the second half of the 19th century, an iconic image of global Christianity might be that of an American evangelist preaching to a capacity crowd at the London Opera House. Today, such opera houses seldom host evangelists, but churches all over the global South are started by local actors and are bursting at the seams. These churches are now better able to serve as prototypical images of global Christianity than anything that is currently happening in the West. The statistics also bear this out. In 1900, Europe was clearly at the center of global Christianity, and Africa had less than 10 million Christians at that time. Today, the global landscape looks very different. Africa has gone from having the least number of Christians to having the most, at roughly 685 million. Asia and Latin America have also increased the raw number of Christians and the percentage share of global Christianity on their continents. So why does this matter? According to some authors, it actually matters very little. This stream of scholarship argues that Christianity's global growth is merely a derivative of European colonialism, followed by American imperialism. Political and economic oppression has been accompanied by cultural hegemony, which has appeared at least in part in the form of Christianity. Demographics may have changed, but Christianity's home, culturally and from a power perspective, remains securely in the West. This way of thinking was dominant among academics in the latter part of the 20th century and continues to be very influential. A paradigm change, or at least a competing school of thought, was established around the beginning of the century. Philip Jenkins' The Next Christendom in 2002, Lamansana's Whose Religion is Christianity in 2003 were not the first contributions to this literature, but they did much to reframe the conversation about global Christianity. This literature, which I call the New Faces framework, takes the longer view of Christian history. Authors point out that Christianity may have journeyed west in the millennia following Christ's birth, but also in the early years journeyed east and south. Christian communities with origins older than European Christianity continue to exist today. Even within the time frame of colonialism, Jenkins points out that Christianity's fastest growth in Africa and elsewhere corresponded not with colonial growth, but with the time periods when colonial powers were rolling back and the Western presence in these regions was receding. Instead of successfully imposing their religion on local actors, argues Jenkins, Westerners had become a constraint on the growth of local Christian communities. As local leaders gained control, Christianity became much more indigenized and non-Western. These 2 points allow Sana and others to fundamentally challenge the idea that Christianity can be classified as a Western religion at all. They also restore agency to actors in the global South, which is not accorded to them in the aforementioned narrative. More recently, scholars like David Swartz have shown the extent to which Christians in the global South and East are not just independent of the West, but they have had considerable influence on how Christianity is practiced within the West. Finally, Jenkins characterizes contemporary Western Christianity as declining. He presents an image of global South Christianity rising as Western Christianity is secularized. Christianity's present and future, as well as some of its past, is in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Let me now introduce Wuthno into the debate here. And that opens up the second theme that I was asked to address, the connection between US Christians and Christianity in the global South. Wuthno accepted many of Jenkins' ideas, but he felt there was empirical deficiencies with the description of Christianity in the West as being inconsequential and detached, especially in an age of globalization. Now, I think, I thought since our eyes have been turned to the Suez Canal recently, I thought this visual of contemporary global shipping lanes might be a good reminder of the extent of our global connectedness. Travel, technology, economy, and politics are all making the world a smaller place. Within that context, Wuthno pointed out that there are still tens of thousands of churches in the US. He and other scholars contend that high levels of interaction exist among Christians across the globe, including and perhaps especially with Christians in the US. Wuthno and similarly minded scholars do not return to the aforementioned political and economic imperialism arguments, but they also do not believe that such connections are made on an even playing field. Rather, they are mapped onto an international political economy that puts North American actors in positions of privilege. Within this context, US Christianity, through faith-based NGOs, overseas missionary efforts, congregational activities, and faith-influenced foreign policy measures continue to be invested in global South Christianity. That may be true, but the uneven playing field of global connections is a serious issue, and it needs a bit more explanation. So some maps might be helpful here. The first map was created and graciously shared by Johnson and Zerlo, and it charts the historical trajectory of Christianity's geographic center. Christianity began in Palestine, and it moved steadily northwest for the first 1,500 years, then southwest for another 400 years or so, until moving decisively southeast beginning in 1950. Johnson and Zerlo estimate that global Christianity's demographic center is currently somewhere in Mali. I want to compare that map to a map created by McKinsey & Company, which traces the world's economic center of gravity over the same time period. The trajectories are strikingly similar, even though the timelines don't match up. It takes 1,800 years for the economic center of gravity to travel much at all. And then it travels rapidly northwest until 1950. Like Christianity in 1950, it also pivots east, but it stays much further north than Christianity's trajectory. impacted more by Asia's financial growth than financial growth in Africa and Latin America. So if we look again at these two maps, first global Christianity's trajectory, and then the economic center's trajectory. And then we look at a 2017 map of GDP per capita. We notice that global Christianity's demographic recentering is tracking towards some of the poorest population centers on the planet, which in this map are represented by some of the lighter colors. The world's economic center of gravity, meanwhile, is tracking towards regions of the world where other religions are in the majority. Given Christianity's continued representation in the affluent West, which we can see on this map, this may mean that inequality within Christianity is greater than inequality within the general global populace. It's within this global context that some usually more educated North American Christians engage political and economic structures in an effort to ameliorate existing inequalities. Amy Reynolds charts efforts made by several groups, including the Presbyterian Church USA, to influence the Central American Free Trade Agreement. She notes that PCUSA's long history of engagement with international economic issues, citing religious values alongside empirical research, stating the PCUSA has endorsed more market protection and regulation, an expanded definition of rights to include economic rights, and increased global governance of the economy. Reynolds notes that Christian values of God's sovereignty, covenant, and hope have been central to their message. So another piece that we have to think about is that wealth is also unevenly distributed within countries. This has been exacerbated by the mixed blessing of a spike in wealth over the last 200 years around the world that is simply unlike anything human history has ever seen. The resulting pockets of wealth around the world means that people with high economic status exist in most countries, even very poor ones. And the resulting transnational elites are those who often facilitate connections between US Christians and Global South Christians. Now there's a lighter side to this. Honduras, for example, is one of the poorest countries in Latin America. A man I will call Jose is a perfectly bilingual Honduran with an engineering degree from Purdue. Jose helps to host many mission teams. He goes to the airport and picks up wide-eyed Americans, and that can get a little monotonous. So he amuses himself by telling first-timers that they are likely to see hippos and giraffes roaming around the streets of his nation's capital. He really enjoys the look on people's faces who believe him. In spite of his sense of humor, Jose is the kind of person that US Christians are better able to relate to than an illiterate Christian in a remote village. Although Jose takes US Christians to visit and work in such villages, he and Hondurans like him are simply more likely to have higher numbers of connections with US Christians than those of remote villagers. US Christians and Global South Christians have found many ways to build relationships across this complicated socioeconomic terrain. The numbers involved in such relationships are considerable. Of the tens of thousands of American churches that Wuthnow referenced, fully 43% engage in some kind of international partnership, according to a recent study by Danny Hunter. I want to highlight some of the more common approaches to these kinds of partnerships. The number of faith-based NGOs has exploded in recent decades, and many are founded in the US with the intent to serve in the Global South. They often have a mandate to partner with local congregations in poor communities. Such NGOs can be large. David King has written about World Vision, which has an annual budget of over $1 billion a year. That's the largest NGO, but several others are budgets that run in the hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Most NGOs, though, are small, like the ones that Alison Schnabel describes. Schnabel notes that more than 10,000 new international aid organizations have been founded by Americans since 1990. The median annual budget for such organizations is around $25,000, according to Schnabel. That's less than a salary and benefits for one full-time employee. While not all of these are faith-based, many are. And many that are not officially faith-based nonetheless facilitate transnational religious connections of some kind. Those who may not be ambitious enough to start an organization may still go on short-term mission trips or be part of a congregation that is involved in international church-to-church partnerships. Millions of Americans go on short-term missions trips every year, or They at least did in pre-COVID world. Their top destinations are all places where strong Christian populations exist to receive them. Kenya and Costa Rica are popular destinations. Yemen and Iran are not. Gary Adler argues that mission trips have become a primary vehicle by which middle-class Americans choose to become aware of distant social problems. Or, argues Adler, that is often the intent. In practice, such trips become a complicated means to unclear, hoped-for ends. The trips are nonetheless popular with Global South pastors and church leaders who receive them, as they have found ways to use such trips to bolster their own ministries and community outreach. Church-to-church partnerships are more durable than isolated mission trips. They arise from a sense among American congregations that they should be connected to their co-religionists in other parts of the world. Janelle Crop Baker explains that many churches are searching for patterns of engagement across global inequalities that place relationships on an even footing. As Hunter states, these relationships become a conduit for exchanging resources, ideas, and teams of people with the purpose of accomplishing something together that contributes to what God is doing in the world. Connections developed through transnational migration are among the most important ways that US Christians are connected to Global South Christians. I think that Jacob is going to be taking this theme up, so I will simply say that migrants in the US continue to share in community with people from their countries of origin. I visited a church in rural El Salvador that has an event each year dedicated to FaceTiming or Skyping with members who now live in the US. Experiences like this are repeated throughout the Global South. Global Christianity is a social movement that is connected in diverse and overlapping ways. Integrated supply chains, uneven resource distribution, and interlocking networks crisscross the globe, knitting together Western and global Southern actors. I conclude by showing one of the 3 photos I proposed at the beginning of the presentation as a possibility for serving as an iconic image of contemporary global Christianity. Elim, pictured here, is an independent church founded by Central Americans. It is a megachurch and is listed as one of the 10 largest churches in the world. It has a wide range of programs and ministries. Elim's members are primarily from the lower classes, but its leaders are very comfortable in transnational settings. Elim receives short-term missionaries from the US, has partnerships with US faith-based NGOs, utilizes educational curriculum written in the US, and has various types of partnerships with US churches. It also sends short-term mission teams to other places, has daughter churches in other countries, including the US, and participates in global networks with Asian and African organizations. In short, Elim is an independent and highly connected exemplar of contemporary global Christianity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Dr. Olupona, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Let me get my stuff. Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Kurin, for the invitation. My title will be Theoretical Implications of African Reverse Missions. So what is reverse mission? One of the most important discoveries I made when I began studying African immigrant religious communities was a phenomenon that I termed reverse missions. And that has since become a widely used in the study of African Christianity and world Christianity as well. It's very likely that you have come across articles in the paper in different places where this term has been invoked. I think I first coined it in the 90s, primarily since the 19th century, but also before in several more isolated cases. Africa has been perceived in the Western world as the site of mission or the recipient of the gospel, which Christianity flowing from the seats of power and authority in Europe to practically every corner of the continent. What my research demonstrated was that in the minds and discourse of many African immigrants to the West, They now understand themselves as taking the gospel back to a Western world whose active participation in the Christian tradition is rapidly waning and is in need of evangelization. That's how they described the reasons for their presence in the West. In this sense, many African Christians understand themselves as reversing that initial flow of Christian missions in the call to make disciples of all nations that they learned from Western missionaries. They view it as their religious duty to carry this message back to the West. Apart from being a fascinating development beginning in the late 20th century and early 21st century, the aspect of the reverse mission that I'll discuss in this brief talk are the conceptual challenges they pose to dominant Western narratives and paradigms, the internal diversity within this phenomenon based on denomination and some of the most important dynamics of the phenomena. After having some time to observe reverse missions in progress and the way they disrupt and challenge the models with which the Western world conceptualizes a number of issues, I've increasingly come to appreciate its far-reaching ramifications in ways that may not have been immediately apparent. The Western world still primarily thinks of Africa as a recipient of what it has to offer. And this is perhaps clearest in religious sense, in the way many American churches still raise money for mission trips for their youth groups to travel to Africa. However, when one looks at the demographic information, in addition to the narratives put forward by the African missionaries in the US and their congregations, it becomes abundantly clear that this model is quite outdated. While a full 28% of the American population is religiously unaffiliated, not to mention Christian, this category on affiliation practically makes no sense in African countries, where Christianity is much more intimately and explicitly integrated with public and private life as well. Even non-Christian Africans are often deeply familiar with the Bible and Christian messages. And it has become clear that the gospel is far more familiar to Africans of all backgrounds than it generally is to Americans. One of the things I often say in my class is that whenever I teach and I have to make references to Christianity, at first I used to assume that my students in religion understand it. Then I found that I was wrong. So I teach African religion. I also indirectly begin to teach Christianity even in the West. As a result, Africa has become the producer of missionaries rather than the receiver. And while the Western world has traditionally viewed Africa as deficient in terms of governance, history, development, religious instructions, etc., from an African Christian perspective, the tables have turned completely with respect to Christianity. Indeed, scholars have been aware of many years that the global center of Christianity has been consistently shifting towards the global South. Many often describes a train of Christianity as starting in the Middle East, stopping in Europe, and arriving now in Africa as its main center. An excellent example of this is how Archbishop Peter Akiola was named as one of Time's most influential people in the world in 2006 and 2007. I often tell people, particularly when I try to quarrel with my own Anglican tradition in Nigeria, that nobody knew this man before the crisis, when he now came to the limelight and people started, talking about him. When they mentioned him as the Archbishop of Nigeria and the primate, I didn't know him. And that I think I would consider to be quite unusual. My father, my grandfather, they all members of this group. And my father was a priest who, in fact, at a certain time had a church in Bristol. Indeed, the numbers support this argument as a plurality of almost 42% of the world Christian Christians are projected to live in just sub-Saharan Africa by 2060. Particularly when one begins to consider the African diaspora in North Africa, the issue of transnationalism brings heightened influence to this issue. Once again, when considering modern global and international dynamics, Africa is often offered only a peripheral position. But in terms of transnationalism, especially in the Christian concept, Africa is very much at the center. As a result of African reverse missions, African Christians and expressions of Christianity have spread all over Americas, Europe, and even Asia. Furthermore, prominent African churches have formed important networks with other churches around the world, particularly in the global south. This particular form of transnationalism raises another critical issue. In the Western world, the limitations of a religious domain as opposed to the secular, as well as its subsequent decline in terms of personal relevance for individuals, is tied to the rise of modernity. Consequently, religion is often tied to conservatism and or tradition as a counterpoint to modern progress. Reverse missions complicate this framework by emerging religion in a sense of transnationalism and globalization, effectively harnessing and integrating modern technology in all they do, and articulating their own notions of progress and individualism in explicitly Christian terms. By resisting some of the more binary frameworks of the modern West, while still embracing some of their features, the most recent wave of African immigrants actively engage with parts of their host societies, but they do not seek to integrate fully into them as assimilation theory, such as the American melting pot would suggest. To give a bit more complex how African reverse missions accomplish all of this, I will now outline the ways the different denominations have historically articulated the phenomena in their own unique manner. First is the Pentecostals. The first and most prominent denominations involved in reverse missions are surely the Pentecostal charismatic churches, and I'll consider them to be the public face of Christianity today, not only in Africa, and I think in the entire world. Beginning at the tail end of the 20th century, and often coinciding with African immigration patterns based on education and occupation rather than religion explicitly, significant numbers of African Pentecostals began residing in North America and Europe. Perhaps the most notable is Sunday Adelaja, who began studying journalism in Belarus, but was also recruited by an American televangelist to help him support Christian communities in the Soviet-controlled Ukraine. Adelaja's case is so fascinating because the strong Soviet policy against religion cleared the ground for him to make a massive impact. And within just a few years, he had become one of the most influential religious and political figures as a result of his African-style brand of Christianity. Because Ukrainians began attending his churches in the thousands, many even credited him with ensuring that the mayor of Kiev won election as a result of his support. Matthew Achille Malowo similarly started Kingsway International Christian Center in London in 1992, and it rapidly became the most popular Black church in the UK and fastest growing in Western Europe. His rapid rise and spectacular financial success, all as a result of his religious vocation, did not fit the model most Brits were used to, and it made him a target of intense media and legal scrutiny. There was always one scandal or another about him in the British press regarding his and the church finances. And while I'm less interested in whether the accusations are accurate or not, what is certain is that an African immigrant acquiring so much power, influence, and money in such a short time, and all on the basis of religion, which was increasingly not a viable avenue for any of those things for native Britons, naturally raised eyebrows. In the US, the most notable example of reverse mission is usually the Redeemed Christian Church of God, under the leadership of Reverend Adeboye. RCCG has become arguably the most successful Pentecostal church in Nigeria, with branches established all over the world using a corporate model not dissimilar from many American companies. The global center of the church is in the Redemption Camp along Lagos-Ibadan Expressway in Nigeria, which has become more of its own self-sufficient state that provides its own electricity, security, education, and other services, all within the structures of the church. The second major center of the church is its camp in Greensville, Texas. The site is enormous, well-funded, and attracts thousands of worshipers on a regular basis. Interestingly, one could even consider it a type of African pilgrimage site outside of Africa. RCCJ is such a good example of the reverse mission because perhaps more than any other church, it not only understands its mission in global and transnational terms, but has been highly successful in establishing itself and projecting its message of salvation and blessing all over the world. Part of the success of Pentecostal reverse mission is that even in the settings where Americans may be familiar with Christianity and even Pentecostalism, they offer a different and new perspectives on the faith that differs from models that many Westerners have abandoned. Protestant mission churches, not to be overlooked, the so-called mainline Protestant mission churches have also increasingly begun to participate in reverse mission. What is unique about their involvement is that they often exist side by side with Western counterparts without fully assimilating into them. What this means is that while the American Episcopal Church is still quite active, Nigerian and African Anglicans have established their own mission churches whose central authority lies not in the Episcopal Church Center in New York, but rather back home in Africa, despite being part of the same global organization. For example, my own church, the Anglican Church of the Epiphany in Cambridge, operates within a diocese totally independent of the Episcopal Church, with its own bishop appointed by the Church of Nigeria. So rather than introducing totally new churches, as with Pentecostals, or assimilating into established ecclesiastical structures, as would normally be assumed by assimilation theory, they have instead been transforming previously regional or national churches into transnational bodies rooted in their home societies, but completely open to members of their host society. I must also stress that this distinction is not merely nominal. The divide between African Anglicans and the Western traditions of Anglicanism became abundantly clear at the Lambeth Conference in 2003, when the African bishops overwhelmingly opposed to a confirmation of the first openly gay bishops in the United States on the grounds that it was not in accordance with biblical tradition. But more than politics, that very, very unfortunate incident caused a systemic rupture within the Anglican Communion that I do not think the Western branch of the church foresaw, because they failed to realize the numerical strength and power of the African church, since power had traditionally always rested firmly in the UK and US. The African bishops formed the Global Anglican Church Conference, GAPCOM, shortly thereafter, and agreed that they could no longer remain in communion with the American church. As such, the Protestant reverse missions not only offer diversity to the practice of each denomination, but also complicate the previously more static boundaries within these churches, such that not all Baptists in the American South will necessarily be part of the Southern Baptist Convention, nor will all members of the Nigerian Baptist Convention live in Nigeria or even be Nigerians. And lastly, the last example is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has so far attracted far less attention with respect to reverse mission, precisely because, unlike the Protestant missions, its ecclesiastical structure was already more transnational in nature. However, if one is attentive to internal dynamics within the church, it is clear that the same phenomena has been taking place, albeit in slightly different form. Rather than being sent out to establish new religious communities by a home church in Africa, African priests have been increasingly relied upon by the Catholic Church to revitalize extant structures and communities. For example, one of my former students recently began teaching in Maine and informed me that the Catholic parish there had 2 Nigerian priests and recently had another from Cameroon. These priests were not stationed there to serve African immigrant populations per se, but rather to serve a largely white congregation. African clergy are in such high demand because fewer Westerners are interested in ordination, and the shortage of priests often implies a heavier workload for those who are ordained. And because of this vibrancy of the church in Africa, most priests are used to celebrating Mass multiple times a day under difficult circumstances and thus can adapt easily. Furthermore, they usually also speak multiple languages, at least one African language, Latin, and one or more modern European languages. And I remember when I did a sabbatical leave in Miami, and I was invited by one of my students to a Catholic church. I could not believe meeting this Igbo Nigerian priest who gave the homily in flawless Spanish. So just to confirm the kinds of, the thesis that we're trying to propose there. The facility with language and identity as immigrants themselves allowed them to connect more naturally with other immigrants, especially Latin Americans, who form an increasingly a prominent part of the church in the US. Again, that's another dimension of this transnationalism and the connection across the global South. On a broader scale, the Catholic Church itself is increasingly global in its perspective. The most recent, of course, is the appointment of Polish, German, and now the first Latin American Pope Francis. For the first time, Black Africans have been seriously considered for the position, but time will not allow me to tell you what actually happened. While Arinze was not made the Pope a few years ago, this was what most of us thought will happen. I must say that as we kind of try to articulate these views of reverse mission in the context of the various denominations, we do see some very fascinating growth and development. There have been, of course, serious context among churches, and we can still say that what we are dealing with here is a church that is still in transition. In conclusion, let me say that the true reverse mission, African Christianity is becoming increasingly influential in the practice of religion in America and American society more generally. Unfortunately, because of the outdated and oftentimes prejudicial conceptual framework used to understand or misunderstand Africans in their religious practice, Western societies tend not to be able to comprehend this critical phenomena properly, as it does not fit neatly into those categories. African reverse missionaries and their congregations are in many ways often more in tune with global trends and transnational networks than most of their host societies, and frequently understand their identities, religious practice, and operation in a much broader context than their host societies imagine or do themselves. With African immigrants composing an increasingly large percentage of American immigrants population, African Christianity is gaining ground in America every day and becoming more vocal in terms of social political engagement. It is becoming even more essential for American society to come to understand and find ways to relate to transnational African Christianity, or it may get surprised and caught off guard in much the way the Anglican Church was. I must warn you that some of my views here, particularly relating to the quarrel within the global Anglicanism, doesn't necessarily represent my views or my opinion. I can comment on it during questions Q&A section. I do believe that what we're seeing here offers us a number of creative possibilities in American society and in our scholarship in terms of the way we complicate contemporary political partisanship and binary thinking, fostering positive foreign relations, revitalizing religious life in the country, and perhaps most importantly, learning to move beyond outdated, inaccurate, and unhelpful categories that obscure more than they highlight. So thank you very much, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Next, we turn to Dr. Purkayastha and Dr. Kibria.
Okay, let's see. So I'm going to start. So our presentation is called Living Hinduism and Islam, South Asian American Negotiations of Religion. So I want to begin by thanking Prema for inviting us to present our work. I do want to mention that what we talk about today draws on the work of an interdisciplinary and international group, including scholars based in South Asia and the United States. This is called the Women's Living Hinduism and Islam Research Network, which is led by Professor Anjana Narayan at Cal State Pomona. So slide 2. Okay, so South Asian Hinduism and Islam have long been part of the American landscape, long history, but I think it is only after the 1965 Immigration Act, which opened up immigration to the US, after that you start seeing South Asians begin entering the US in significant numbers and also become a visible part of American life. So both South Asian Hinduism and Islam, they remain minority religions in a predominantly Christian landscape. Current estimates are that there are about 3.45 million Muslims living in the US. This is 2017 Pew estimates, and that Muslims make up about 1.1% of the total US population. And of Muslims, South Asians constitute approximately 26% of Muslims in the US. Hindu Americans, most of whom are of South Asian origin, constitute less than 1% of the population. So I think the important thing about this history of immigration, contemporary immigration, is that after 1965, there was a significant influx of professional and highly educated immigrants from South Asia. And as a result of this, I mean, this is reflected in the religious life and institutions in the sense that these were professionals who developed the resources to build religious institutions in the US. And at the same time, their children growing up in the US were also experiencing exclusion and racism. So I think this, the combination of both the highly educated professional background of many South Asian immigrants combined with experiences of racism are very important to understanding how the religious landscape has developed. So next slide.
Thank you. I'll take it over there from there. And also with the thanks to Professor Prema Kurian for inviting us. So I want to point out a few things about Hinduism, because the point I wish to make is the point we've noted on the slide about the retreat to the temples actually happens as part of that assimilation process. So assimilation, I'm sure you all know it, so you'll forgive me for repeating it. Assimilation broadly, assimilation as it applies to migrants, has assumed that migrants will come and learn the language, they'll acquire educational skills, they'll live in non-immigrant neighborhoods, they'll work in mainstream jobs, and they'll be part of mainstream organizations. Now, given the profile that Dr. Kibria just described, after 1965, this influx of very highly educated migrants from the US, who actually mostly joined white-collar occupations and mostly lived in suburbs, which were again mostly white, given the residential segregation evident on the landscape, then this question of assimilation actually rests on one part of that last criteria, that is mainstream organizations. And of course, South Asians are in all kinds of non-religious mainstream organizations. I don't need to mention it. But once it comes to religion, despite this constant dialogue about America being open to multiple religions, and it is in a way, but what also happened is that the American notion of religious landscape, that is the space and time through which religious landscapes are produced, is very much based on what is normal for Christianity. So for instance, the day you have off to do religion is still Sunday. Whether or not it suits any of the Hindus is quite beside the point. So what Hindus and highly educated Hindus who actually, and people with the kind of earning power who could build institutions, actually found that religion could not be done outside the precincts of temples, for example. So here I pause and I want to say something. As a Hindu, the idea of faith-based practice, it's just one of four main ways in which I can do religion. Hinduism is extremely diverse. It does not have one book. It does not have one prophet. My colleague, Dr. Manisha Desai, who's the head of the Department of Sociology right now, and is a Hindu from India, she and I do not share a single religious celebration, right? And I want to emphasize this diversity because what I want to get to in this pressure that you can only do religion within temples, then all the rest of the diversity simply gets either suppressed or minimized or not possible on the American landscape. So the dominant version of doing Hinduism in America actually retreated to temples. And once it retreated to temples, it had to comply with the laws of the country, which required congregational membership. This is fundamentally very much unlike how Hinduism has been practiced in India and still continues to be practiced. So you already have a retreat to the temple, the development of congregational style, religious practice and identities, and the version that relies on temples and priests automatically became the dominant version because that was the version that was recognized by the country, so to speak. And with the development of this version, what became important for the migrants was to try and find some practices that kind of mimicked what the Christian children of Christian friends of their children would be asking them about all the time. Like, where do you go to worship? Which book do you read? Do you celebrate Christmas? If you don't celebrate Christmas, what do you celebrate at that time? So some rituals that were already not meaningful in swaths of India got revived through the temples, because the minute you have priests, you begin to have priests of a higher caste. I happen to come from a part of the country where all of our major celebrations happens out in public spaces, not in temples, worshipping female goddesses. And the whole idea is different kinds of religions can come together. That's kind of difficult to do here, though a version has been done. So this last point is what I want to emphasize. So on the one hand, for the purpose of trying to find a language and a practice that would be more legible to people who are only attuned to thinking about Christianity, there were these changes on the American scene that began to mimic Christianity. And the second part of it was, as we mentioned here, by retreating to the temples, what happened is the fluidity and the enormous diversity of Hinduism, it hasn't gotten worn away, but it's definitely suppressed and not at all visible on the American landscape. So I'm going to stop here. I can answer more questions later on.
So moving on to the Muslim, South Asian Muslim experience. And of course, I don't at all mean to suggest that reduce or downplay the differences between Hinduism and Islam as religions. However, I think that there are similar themes to what Bandana just described in the sense of mosque-centered pressures, the pressures to create a religious life around recognizable institutional structures. So there's similar types of assimilationist pressures in that respect. But in the case of Islam and South Asian Muslims, I think what you also see are sort of, the forces, for one, of kind of racialization, the racialization of Islam, and, especially visible, I guess, after 9/11, Islamophobia, the construction of the Western political construction of Islam and Muslims as the enemy, and, the sense of stigmatization around Islam. So I think that these forces have ironically encouraged, or at least made visible, certain unitary responses and organizations. And for immigrants coming from South Asia, I would say that these pressures of stigmatization have kind of also integrated with the kind of coming together of Islam from various parts of the world that happens in the US, immigrants from various countries, American Islam, to some extent they come together. And there is definitely a kind of an anchor, a certain pressure to develop a sort of unitary sort of version or response, a set of understandings and practices. So once again, the pluralism of Islamic practice that you see or that you have seen traditionally in South Asia has really sort of is reduced in the American context. Next slide. So I think that, one of our points, just to sort of reiterate, is, as Bandana mentioned, that in contrast to the often held assumption that the American landscape fosters religious pluralism, this has not exactly been the case with Hinduism and Islam. In fact, assimilationist pressures in combination with the forces of stigma and resistance to it have fostered an environment that has discouraged the heterogeneity of these religious traditions. Bandana.
Thank you. And I want to then turn to this question of transnationalism. And I want to kind of define transnationalism the way we as sociologists kind of understand it. And this is not simply about, entities in one country traveling to other country. The transnational sphere is a sphere that works through countries, is constantly lived. So in the case, the kind of immigrants we're talking about, I could be living in the US, but a good deal of my life is also carried on with people in other countries. So at the people level, that constant interchange based on technology, based on visits and so on is true. But along with that is this other fact, which we will bring up again, that according to that venerable institution, the World Bank, remittances from migrants now constitutes 3 times the total amount of development assistance by countries. So there is a lot of money circulating from diasporas to home countries. And the question is, through which channels do they flow? Of course, there are politics involved in this. There are economic interests, including religio-economic interests that are involved in this. But the flow of all that money towards home countries actually has an impact. And this is where, as we'll talk again, and we'll show again, that who the diaspora people are and what kind of influences are they in a position to start circulating through transnational spheres becomes important. And of course, we did put up this whole definition specifically to do with religions, because institutions in the US, I can speak about Hindu institutions, but I know equally about Muslim institutions, especially the ones that have more people from particular countries in South Asia. These are part of an international, well-integrated network of institutions. So the ideas, the money, the people, and all of these influences flow back and forth, often again through technology. That means it can happen multiple times a day. And that's indeed what happens. And of course, Hindus and Muslims are enmeshed in this transnational sphere. And now we will actually let you hear about these influences and the voices of some of the women that we talked to. Nazli.
Yeah, so we wanted to give some sense of how these things are experienced on the ground, and how these transnational forces are experienced. And so we're drawing here from our data on South Asian professional women in the US. And here you see a woman who we're calling Sabia, from a Bangladeshi origin woman. And so she talked on the one hand a great deal about her experiences of feeling marginalized in the wealthy and largely white suburban neighborhood where she lived, with her husband and 2 young children. And she lived in a sort of very progressive, liberal neighborhood, but the sort of the ideas, the sort of homogenous and negative ideas that she encountered about Muslims and Islam continually reminded her of the sort of pervasiveness of stigma towards Islam. So on the other hand, the second sort of interview quote shows another dimension of her sort of transnational negotiations. So she talked about when she, visited Bangladesh, how she found herself in another space where she found herself arguing with progressive feminist friends who are part of the movements for women's equality in the country. So Sabia's political consciousness was deeply shaped by the stigma she felt in the US towards Islam. But her friends assess these things in a very different way. And I'll just read one part of it, because it's interesting. So there is a tension when I go home to Bangladesh. If I make a comment that is somewhat sympathetic with how people are more publicly Muslim now than they were in the past, I get dismissed. They say, "What do you know? Sitting in your privileged circumstances in America." I'm labeled as an apologist for Islamic fundamentalism. They remind me, well, you don't live here, so you don't understand how fundamentalism is really affecting our country. You live in America, so it's easy for you to say or defend these movements. So the point being, in this particular case, Sabia was negotiating these very different, intersecting, but also somewhat conflicting transnational currents. And she had trouble situating herself within them. Oh, Bandana.
Okay, so I'll actually present some of the quotes, not from one person, but from multiple people. I'm first going to quote somebody who was actually born in the US. And she talks about how, having grown up constantly with a Christian normativity in schools and everywhere else, she has felt the need to assert her Hindu pride. And as it so happens, this particular person is in a relationship or a marriage with somebody of a very different religion. But what she says is she tried to teach some rituals to her child. And once she started picking on those rituals to teach her child as a way of identifying with Hinduism, many of the progressive Hindus who, as she said, came to this country at least when they were in graduate school, that is, they didn't have to battle for their Hindu identity back in India, those people kind of chided her, saying those are caste-based rituals. And she says that, I bolded this, they did not necessarily experience the harassment and bullying and just the absolute marginalization that many of us grew up with in the United States as Indian Americans or as Hindus and Muslims. And of course, when you grow up that way, you want to have something to hold on to, something to show your pride. But she also said very emphatically, at the same time, we have been the ones who are calling out white Christian privilege and how it pervades us. So that's one way of thinking of this larger transnational sphere where people growing up here feel racialized and marginalized, as Nazli has pointed out in the case of, Muslim young boys and girls, and this Hindu woman was saying the same thing. But along with the same idea of how do people who are Americans fit in with the transnational spheres back home, I put in these two quotes because these actually are pertinent to understanding some of the tensions that not only happen here, but the tensions that are intrinsic to the status of people from America back in the countries of origin or their parents' countries of origin. So one of the women said that more than 20 years after leaving India, I see Muslims being persecuted. That is, this is a Hindu woman talking about Muslims being persecuted in India and targeted for eating beef. And it strongly rejects this. This is a long quote, I've just taken up parts of it. But she says it's all deeply disturbing to me. This is not, how she grew up, what she believes in, and her whole issue is Hinduism never said that anybody else's beliefs is less than, my belief. And so what is happening in India is most worrisome. And another person, though, challenged her ideas to a certain extent and says that, is it the Hinduism that we grew up with changed? No. And she says what happened is the kind of people who are engaging in these acts, that is, targeting Muslims, targeting other minority religions, they have gotten power because our generation of Hindus living here and in Australia and in Europe have given the money and power to those groups. And that is the issue of transnationalism that, both Nazli and I want to highlight. And we will come back to this again. But just to give you, I think, two pictorial visions of what we're talking about, we want to show you this, or these two slides. So these are slides of Hinduism, Hindu temples in India. This is the oldest temple. This is the kind of temple that's being built very rapidly in the US, as a matter of fact. I wanted to show the political connections that were in the news a couple of years ago. This kind of worship still happens, but I can answer questions on that later on because it is not typical, and it's certainly not in temples. Nazli?
Yes, so these are just some pictures which I photographed. And this is a mosque in Texas, the picture of the mosque. But I also wanted some images to show how much the political context of Islam is really shaping people's responses. And in some ways, ironically, I mean, not completely, but ironically is also kind of leading towards a development of a more sort of unified sort of Muslim movement in the US.
So we want to sum up, just to leave enough of time to have questions and answers. That is, as Nazli mentioned before, that while we tend to believe that the American religious landscape encourages plurality and encourages diversity, it only does so in very particular ways. And one of the arguments that certainly we are making is that those particular ways actually foster the strands of Hinduism, particularly, and to a certain extent also Islam, that are closer to the structures of Christianity. And so the assimilation from that perspective, people do not convert, but their practices become more Christian-like, then result in a whole lot of American influences being kind of sent back to the home countries. And I'll mention this about Hinduism, but it's also going back to India, and also to a certain extent, the migrant influences from various countries, including the US, going back to Bangladesh, which basically push this version of one kind, one dominant kind, one powerful kind, which is based on these temples and based on these very exclusively bounded kind of religious practices, which even in fairly recent history, at least between Bangladesh and parts of India, that exclusive boundary has not been as true. But to the extent that diasporic people come with so much of money, I checked the figures for India and Bangladesh. Right now, according to the World Bank, India is getting about $78 billion from its diaspora, and Bangladesh is getting about $17 billion from the diaspora. That kind of money comes with a lot of power to buy up a lot of politicians who will allow people to get the kind of lands and do the kinds of things which are, in a sense, American in structure. So I will stop there. Nazli, if you have anything more, otherwise I'll stop sharing.
I think we should stop and thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was an amazing panel. This is exactly what I had visualized and I had hoped. So thank you again, for being part of this panel. Very exciting. I think it opens up so many new ways of thinking about religion in the US, and I hope, the audience has found it helpful as well. So, I know I have several questions, but let me start with some of the questions that we've got already. Okay, so this last question I think is to everybody and is the broadest. So is Gerardo Marti, and he says that he's interested in politics, especially in the US, but also among global structures of dominance, and whether any of the panelists would like to comment on the implications of global religious shifts or changes on political power that we are likely to see. going forward, whether it is due to these transnational links between, religion in the US and South Asia, or, the African case of, the reverse missionaries and how they are taking such an important lead in some ways in global Christianity, or the movement of Christianity outside to other parts of the world. I don't know if any of you would like to address that question about, politics and, the connections between politics and global religious shifts that we are likely to see.
I can go, but I'd rather wait for others.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I deliberately left out a section of my paper that would have referred to the Africans' take on Trump's government when we woke up and suddenly found out that a sizable number of Africans, not just the evangelicals, were pro-Trump. And during the last election, there were groups here that sponsored folks in Nigeria to campaign for him and to demonstrate publicly. So the question is why? It has to do with, part of it also, the influence of the conservative evangelical Christians in America on Africa and the African proponents. And at times, it relates to the kinds of agenda that some of these churches are, professing, even those of them in the reverse mission structures who are here. There are, as liberal as perhaps we may want to describe them, I don't like the term liberal and conservative that Americans often use to describe Africans. The truth of the matter is that in terms of their policies, in terms of their agenda, they are very similar to some of the things that the evangelical Christians in America are doing. And so this is causing a lot of tension. So when people like us who are scholars now try to interject and say, what is this? They just don't understand what we're talking about. So that's one effect that I have seen, and I think a political, in terms of the political dimension. If I may, very quickly, let me respond to another question, which is also very political.
Yeah, sure.
Addressed to me. A very fascinating question. Why is it that the situation in Ukraine, compared with United States and Britain, was very different? What happens, of course, in Ukraine was that when Adelaja got there, or even before he got there, the hunger for religion after these years of Soviet Union control was very high. There was no doubt about it. It was like being prepared for the coming of the gospel. And of course, you now find Adelaja, who was very savvy in terms of, his own take on publicity, his message, charismatic preacher. So it was not difficult for Adelaja to kind of hook onto that and to begin to, convert a lot of people. You're talking of large numbers of people who now became became members of this church. Now, the situation in America is very different. In the case of United States, the language is already there. English was the medium of expression. In the case of Ukraine, there was no such thing. So you have to, kind of learn the language, and the language of the people now became the medium for expressing, the gospel. But in the case of America itself, the folks came, they were insisting mainly in Igbo and speaking Yoruba and Igbo and Efik and the rest of them. And so it has a totally different thing. So I will say that what was on ground in terms of the place will be a kind of will affect the response to the kinds of mission work that the these churches are pursuing in Europe and in America. The case of Britain is very different. British people guided them very well. They never allowed them to blossom. You know, Elijah was deported because he bought a piece of land which was right at the center of London. And the British woke up and said, this is happening in London? Then they went after him. And, you know, he had to run out and he returned back to Nigeria. So we have to complicate these matters. And the history of the countries will be and the culture will be very important in understanding this phenomenon. Yeah.
Thank you. But let's return to the question about the links between politics and religion. And I know that Bandana and Nazli, in one of your slides, you had Trump and Modi. So maybe you want to say more about that, or you know, religious fundamentalism, the links between the US and other countries. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm going to raise just a couple of points, and I know Nazli has a lot to say about this also. So historically, anytime countries have tried to exert their dominance on the global sphere, they've usually mobilized religion as the source of the passion to do it, and they've used religion and lately modernity to say they are trying to establish dominance because they're bringing these good things to other places. And women have always been one of those symbolic, what can I say, one of the symbols around which these efforts have gotten rallied. So to answer your question based on, and I'll just stick to the Hindu part of it, that the way I see politics happening globally right now is, on the one hand, you have this tremendous influence of American Hindus pouring money into India to build certain kinds of temples and to try and push certain kinds of ways of doing Hinduism. But at the same time, India, this is not by any means just from the US to India. India has a lot of influence on a lot of other countries. So there's almost this circular influence going around. And while it's not part of this talk, I'm just going to throw it in. You should try and watch and see which countries are contributing vaccines to other countries to try and understand how the spheres of influence are getting shaped right now. So sorry for the transgression. I'll shut up and let Nazli answer.
Yeah, Nazli, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think the vaccines question is very, very interesting. But I just want to sort of just take a stab at a more global sort of answer to the question that was posed in the chat. So, I mean, clearly sort of, I think that, the general notion that sort of religion is in decline and that religion is in, we've debunked that idea, right? And clearly, I think that it has, in some ways, the relationship between religion and politics has actually sort of been reinforced. I think there's not, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I think sort of the neoliberal global economy, ironically, has in some ways contributed to that. But also the decline of sort of, nationalism, if we're talking about 20th century history, the post-colonial movements, which were sort of based on nationalism, secular nationalism, their decline, I think, has kind of, in combination with the development of the global economy. I mean, with respect to my own country in Bangladesh, which is, you see what's happening there on the ground as really a sort of a confluence of many things. Remittances, as Bandana was mentioning, are a huge factor in the economy, the second largest source of foreign exchange. You have migrants going to the Middle East, going to Malaysia, experiencing different kinds of sort of Islam and modernity, Islamic modernity in Malaysia, and returning back with those. So at the same time, in Bangladesh has become really a sphere where, it's sort of the NGO capital in the world. And I sort of saw the NGOs which have religious missions and purpose have also become a huge part of the landscape. So probably have not answered the question, but those are my thoughts at the moment.
Thank you. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think for sort of the global scene in Christianity, it has to be an issue-specific answer. And so I'll just, maybe a foundational understanding of that would be that if you think of freedom as sort of the foundational principle of Enlightenment thinking, global Christians are going to be very interested in freedom. They believe that freedom in Christ is a pretty important element of their belief system, and freedom generally is something they're in favor of. They also are going to take traditional values, as Jacob was talking about, with respect to sexuality and other issues. So this interesting sort of freedom, more progressive, Enlightenment, more traditional sort of issues. And that shows up, say, in El Salvador with migration. And that evangelicals in El Salvador were floored by the recent wave of anti-immigration sentiment in the US under the previous president. They were absolutely against that, that went against everything that they understood. And they were very happy to be undocumented migrants into this country within those contexts with a completely clear conscience. In South Africa, Rhema Bible Church is a major church in South Africa, and the leaders there are very interested in supporting Cyril Ramaphosa, who's sort of a classical liberal sort of kind of a person, as opposed to sort of the previous president there, Zuma. And so you see these different elements of politics showing up in different ways on specific issues.
Thank you. So there's one more question for you about whether Christianity is becoming polycentric, instead of saying, well, it was first focused in the West and now it's focused in the global South. So Danny Hunter asks, is Christianity becoming polycentric instead of, do we need to find a place where it is centered?
Yeah, and I think that's, some of what Bandana was saying, some of those things are also relevant for Christianity. Like, I think the more we can understand a sort of a polycentric understanding of this, the more we can highlight the different sort of colorings of this global faith. We talk about the global South. Well, I don't know, is Korea in the global South? Probably not, right? But it's certainly not a Western country either. And so, a church in Argentina should be very different than a church in Kenya, and so on and so forth. But these places are all sort of have blossoming centers of Christianity that are manifesting in different ways. And so if we can take a more fine-grained understanding and understand new centers as opposed to and established centers, I think that provides a much better portrayal of our global Christian situation.
Thank you. There are a couple of other questions, but I want to come back to this question about religious nationalisms, authoritarianisms, linked with authoritarianisms in several countries in the world. We had Trump, but we have somebody equivalent in India, and we see this in many countries in the world. Is there any link, between this, these phenomena around the world, all kind of happening at around the same time? What do you all think?
If I were to answer that, I don't think it's religion per se. Religion is certainly used, and religion in many ways forms the basis of many of the messages through multiple social media platforms that ultimately serve the purpose of upholding the dominance of one group and centralizing power. And that's basically the two ingredients that lead to authoritarian kind of political economies. So I think whichever religion it is, in whichever country, that you're seeing this kind of authoritarianism, religion does get used for that purpose. Is it about the core of religion? Perhaps not. It's very much about the power to harness a particular kind of money, a particular kind of effort. And if it's done through the guise of religion, then that's an easy identity to mobilize for the purposes of authoritarianism, which kind of actually goes to that last question asked in the question box, the British colonial impact.
Yeah.
I mean, the British, of course, always said they were in India, at that time, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, to civilize and Christianize the country, and they failed. And they failed because there was sufficient diversity and sufficient pushback, and their inability to make severe inroads into every aspect of life of the people in those countries. Whereas when we look at migrants here, I mean, here I am, a person with a PhD and so on. I do not believe in those dominant casteist forms of religion. But the thing is, that means I'm outside the formal religious institutions, and I am never going to be asked to speak about religion. That will be asked of the priest or somebody else who might know far less than me, because the trend here is to think of religion in those terms, that there is a priest in an institution, and that's the best person who knows. So I'm throwing these out as part of my answer to this larger issue of authoritarianism. If you end up saying there are only 3 people who can make pronouncements, you've already centralized power. That's the basis of it. Sorry to be long-winded about that.
No, that's fine. Anyone, Nazli, do you want to say anything, or anyone else? So there is a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw. It's talking about the role of caste and class among, transnational religious identities. How does class impact transnational religious identities, and then caste? Does one play a bigger role than the other? That's for Nazli and Bandana.
I kind of already answered it in chat.
Okay.
Nazli has something.
Oh, in chat, okay.
Yeah, just taking a look at it now. Haven't seen it. Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting question, because I think that, in the case of there are definitely class distinctions, but I think there are also similar pressures on Muslims regardless of class. So you do see a certain convergence there, actually. Class identities remain important, but there's also a gravitation towards a certain understandings of Islam practices, certain central institutions. So I think that, that's something that actually, I think, goes across a lot of the class divisions that I see. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the chat asks about religious identity, Sunni versus Shia, Ahmadi, Ismailis. It's and I've even I'm from Bangladesh, and I have friends also from Pakistan, and I think we've often talked about, when growing up in those countries, we had never heard of these things. And they were completely invisible in the landscape. And this is partly because they were sort of probably majority Sunni, Sunni sort of communities and societies. But I mean, there's a feeling that even some of these distinctions are distinctions that kind of almost try to follow sort of a Christian model of sex. I mean, I'm not saying that there are not differences. Obviously, Sunni and Shia are major differences, and Ahmadi also. But I think in terms of how they're viewed and framed in stone, it seems to me also to be related to a particular colonial history, because I'm not sure that the divisions are, this is kind of throwing it out. The divisions were have had the same meaning that they have today in the past. So that's just a thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time. It's 4 o'clock. So let me wrap this up by thanking the panelists again for this wonderful, eye-opening session. And to the audience, thank you all for attending, and hopefully we will see many of you at our October conference. And as I said, we still have not finalized whether it's going to be in person or virtual. We will, we are still working on that because we don't have the information right now. But as soon as we do, we will put it up and announce it. So thank you again. Bye-bye, everybody.